Thank you, Jen. Welcome, everyone. I hope that you're enjoying the conference, our campus, and our beautiful community of Pueblo, which you could probably see a bit better if there weren't so much snow, but it has its own beauty. I've been to several of the panels today, and they've been outstanding. And before I say a few words about our next speaker, I'd like to point out that I hope you're here in closing tomorrow, because we have some community members who are sitting right in front here that we're going to be thanking. Without their help, we wouldn't have the ICR, and we wouldn't have some of the monies that have been attributed to us. So hopefully you will be here tomorrow. Now, how honored we are to have the man that many call the father of cannabis research here at the conference to present our keynote address. Dr. Raphael Mechoulam is often considered the most prominent figure in the world of cannabis research, as his groundbreaking discoveries are the basis for nearly every piece of research conducted today. His presence at the ICR conference is truly a historical event, and we are deeply appreciative. And now I'd like to bring out our provost, Dr. Rick Kreminski, who will introduce Dr. Raphael Mechoulam.
Good afternoon, everyone. So, my name is Rick Kreminski, as the president just stated, and I serve CSU Pueblo as the provost and executive vice president here. It's my pleasure to introduce the plenary speakers at ICR 2017, which, as everyone here knows, is a multidisciplinary conference devoted to all things cannabis. And as you also know, our plenary speakers are a very distinguished group of researchers. Right now, in particular, I want to introduce to you Dr. Raphael Mechoulam. Dr. Mechoulam has had a long and distinguished academic career that continues seemingly unabated and strong and vigorously in what is now its 6th decade. Over this time, according to Google Scholar, he has published hundreds of scientific articles in peer-reviewed journals. I think it's about 400. And this work has been cited tens of thousands of times. I think it's approaching 100,000 citations. He also is inventor on dozens of patents. Born in Bulgaria, Dr. Mechoulam emigrated to Israel at age 18. He received his Master's of Science from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem in 1952, then served in the Israeli army for 3 years, where he met his wife, Dalia, who also is here with us today. In fact, she's right here in the front row. Dr. Mechoulam received his Ph.D. at the Weizmann Institute. From 1959 to 1960, he held a postdoc in the United States at the Rockefeller Institute in New York, returning to the Weizmann Institute before settling at Hebrew University. He was an administrator, a rector, which is essentially the academic provost at Hebrew University for 3 years before deciding that he much preferred research to administration, which is something that I struggle with on a minute-by-minute basis. Other than that distraction, he has been an organic chemist focusing primarily on the chemistry of natural products, and has been a Lionel Jacobson Professor of Medicinal Chemistry for some 40 years. Dr. Mechoulam was elected a member of the Israel Academy of Sciences in 1994. Among numerous other honors, he was awarded the Israel Prize in Chemistry in 2000. He received an honorary doctorate at Ohio State. He received a Special Discovery Award from the United States National Institute on Drug Abuse, from NIDA, in 2011. As probably most of you know, Dr. Mechoulam has been associated with virtually all the seminal discoveries in cannabis, starting with the isolation, determination of chemical composition and structure, and synthesis of the major cannabinoids, namely CBD, what was then known as delta-1 tetrahydrocannabinol, then renamed delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC, and CBG, the precursor to both. So to repeat, isolation, chemical structure determination, and synthesis of CBD, THC, CBG, and others. And this was all in the early 1960s. Then, one of his future postdocs was involved in the discovery of what we now know as the CB1 receptor in mammalian brains. These receptors are now known to be the most ubiquitous receptors in the central nervous system and occur in other areas of the human body. Then, Dr. Mechoulam's lab found the first endogenous cannabinoid, which they named anandamide, and subsequently the second endogenous cannabinoid, namely 2-AG, which is essentially arachidonic acid and glycerol. While we have 3 plenary speakers here, yeah, I'm sorry. So that concludes my remarks. So if everyone here, you'll understand why in a few minutes, but in any case, I want you all now to join me in welcoming Dr. Mechoulam to the podium for his lecture.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, many thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure to come to Pueblo. It's a pleasure to know the scientists that are involved in the new Institute for Cannabinoid Research, and I have no doubt that we shall see advances made from Pueblo in the entire field in the various aspects that are associated with cannabis. Let me start with something that Rainer Maria Rilke, European poet, wrote almost 120 years ago. He says, "I live my life in widening circles," and so on and so on, "and I may not complete the last one, but I give myself to it." Well, he may be describing, in his own words, cannabinoids, because here we have advances made all the time. There are phases. There's an original phase, a later phase, a third phase, and I'll be talking about these phases. So there is always a widening circle of information, of knowledge, and it's becoming more and more important. And to the extent that Nature, probably the major journal in science, had 4 reviews. This is a review that was written by my group, and it shows the brain and cannabis growing out of the brain. Well, this was not such an important topic 50 years ago when we started work. As a matter of fact, I asked for a grant at that point, and I was told by the NIH, well, cannabis is not used in the US. A few musicians use it, but it's used in Mexico. When you have something more relevant, approach us. Well, it turned out that it became relevant next year. I mean, the year following it. People from NIH came over and said, "Are you still working?" And we had, by that time, isolated the main active product, compound, THC in a pure form, and elucidated its structure. And they took it and smuggled it back into the US. They didn't have a license. I didn't know that they were doing it. And it turned out that an important person, maybe a senator, his son had been caught smoking pot, and he wanted to know whether his mind was being destroyed. And NIH didn't know anything about it. They didn't have a single grant in the field. Well, things have changed. And the reason the things have changed, you can see in this slide, which is from a review published by investigators, senior investigators at NIH. And it says, modulating endocannabinoid activity may have therapeutic potential in almost all diseases affecting humans. They give a long list and they give references. Now, these are very serious investigators at NIH in Washington. They wouldn't write something so strong if they didn't have the background. Well, the endocannabinoid system is involved, I'm not sure whether in almost all diseases, but in a huge number of diseases. And that's why Today we have hundreds of researchers working in different aspects of the cannabinoid field. And I will try to show a little bit of things that we have done, other things that other researchers have been doing. Well, I would start by emphasizing that there are, at the moment at least in the way I see it, 3 phases of cannabinoid research. The first phase had to do with the constituents of the plant, THC, cannabidiol, and so on. The second one had to do with the compounds, the cannabinoids that we produce, cannabinoids that are produced in the vertebrate body, in the brain, also in the periphery. And the third phase, most people don't realize that there is a third phase. There are a lot of compounds in our body which are like the endogenous compounds that had previously been looked at. And these compounds affect a huge number of diseases or huge number of physiological states. So I would like to say a few words about all the 3 phases. And let me just start at the beginning, or what I think is the beginning. Many thousands of years ago, cannabis was used both in China and in the Middle East in essentially those fields in which we use them today. It was used as the drug that takes away the mind, another bad definition of getting high. It was used as in neurological diseases, apparently. We're not sure, but it seems to be so. And it was used in some religious rites. Well, this is not so different from what we're doing today. This is something that was published a few thousand years after what I showed you, the Assyrians. And this is the physician of Queen Victoria who wrote a paper. He doesn't mention Queen Victoria, but it was known that he refers to her. Queen Victoria had headaches, very strong headaches, and he used to import cannabis from India because the British cannabis was not good enough for her. Well, now starting with our own work in 1963, quite a long time ago, I'm a natural products chemist. I work on the chemistry of compounds found in plants and animals. And I was a little bit surprised to find out that while morphine had been isolated in the 19th century and cocaine was known also a long time, the chemistry of cannabis was not that well known. People, very good people, had worked on it, but the active compound had apparently never been isolated in pure form, and although its structure was guessed more or less, it was not really known. Now that's not just a chemical problem, because there is no way there is pharmacology or clinical work can be done with compounds that are not well defined. Pharmacology, modern clinical work has to be done in exact terms. And if you cannot actually say we took so many milligrams of something and we know what we're doing and we know the metabolism, well, it cannot be done. So at that point, there were very, very few groups working cannabis. Maybe there were also legal problems. But anyway, when we started work, we got from the police smuggled cannabis. It's hashish. There is a good collaboration between Lebanese Arabs and Israeli Jews in smuggling cannabis from the Lebanon. And they show these bags. They're called soles because they were smuggled originally in shoes. So they were called soles. And they would throw them above the boat and they would go on. And about 10% of these soles were found by the police. And I asked the police whether they can give me a little bit, and they said no problem. So I went there, I took 5 kilograms of hashish, and went on a bus. People were quite surprised by the strange smells that were around. And we started working. Then it turned out that we had broken the laws, and the police had broken the laws, so we were not allowed to do that, and we should have got permits from the Israeli NIH, and which is in the Ministry of Health. So next time I went to the Ministry of Health, and it so happened that my students were working there. So we had a cup of coffee, and they said, okay, and they signed a piece of paper, and for the next 30 years it was possible for me to get essentially any amount of cannabis to work on. So we started working, and then we realized why it had been so difficult to work with cannabis. Turned out that there is a huge number of cannabinoids, compounds found in cannabis. Those of you who remember your high school chemistry will see that many of these compounds present there are essentially of the same structure. At least the right-hand side is the same, and the left-hand side, which comes from terpenes, is different, and there are about 100 compounds, and you can see the names there and the years we identify these compounds. One of them was really known by Roger Adams in this country in 1940, etc. And we identify these compounds through the structures and made them available. Now, the plant actually doesn't produce these compounds. These compounds are secondary. The plant produces their precursors, the acids. The plant produces cannabidiolic acid. The plant produces THC acid, 2 of them actually. But these compounds are not stable, and therefore they have not been investigated thoroughly, because it's very difficult to work with an unstable compound. You give an unstable compound to a mouse, you never know whether it's the compound itself that acts or whether it is one of its degradation products. So very little work has been done, but recent work has shown that these compounds are indeed very important, these precursors. As a matter of fact, a Canadian group has shown that in prevention of vomiting, cannabidiolic acid is 1,000 times or maybe 2,000 times more active than cannabidiol itself. So there is going to be a lot of work on these compounds. But the compounds that we had in hashish, which had stayed with the police for some time and didn't contain any of the acids, or contained very little of them, the 2 compounds were cannabidiol and THC. We isolated these compounds in pure form. Cannabidiol had been known, but the structure was not well defined. And we elucidated the structures using modern methods, modern at that time, 50 years ago. And these are still the 2 most important, or the 2 compounds that have been looked into most thoroughly, with the THC being the compound that causes the high, and CBD, a compound which is of great interest as a therapeutic compound, and I'll be speaking about both of them, particularly cannabidiol. And what are these compounds being used for? Well, prevention of the side effects of cancer chemotherapy. As we know, unfortunately, many of the anti-cancer compounds have side effects, and these, or at least some of them, or most of them, can be prevented by cannabis. And indeed, we did even a clinical trial after some preclinical work. There is a department in one of the hospitals in Jerusalem that deals with anti-cancer work in children, anti-cancer treatment of children. Luckily, most of them recover, but the treatment, at least at that time, and even today, is not a pleasant one. The children were crying most of the time. Their parents were in a bad shape. It is a very difficult situation. So we decided to give a couple of milligrams, up to 5 milligrams per child twice a day under the tongue of THC, and we were very surprised to see that we prevented essentially in children all the side effects. The children didn't cry anymore. The children got their drugs and they couldn't care less. And this went on. We gave it 400 times. We published it. Unfortunately, it's still not being used in all hospitals, but it's there. It works extremely well. And this is with THC. There is another thing, that THC acts on appetite and feeding. It's not just that it enhances feeding. We tried that in mice. And we found that mice in which the endocannabinoid system was blocked, they didn't suck. Although the mother was there, the mouse was there, the pups didn't do anything. They just sat around and they actually died of hunger, although the mother was there, because their cannabinoid system was blocked. Once it is deblocked, I mean, that prevention of using the cannabinoid system, they went ahead and sucked and lived. So it is not just feeding, it's something much more essential, or very essential, like suckling. Now, what about cannabidiol? Well, cannabidiol does not cause any of the central nervous system effects of THC. It acts completely differently. There are several mechanisms to which it acts. I will not go into the biochemical details, but it's most definitely acting in a variety of ways, and it is most definitely of a great importance as a medicinal agent. But this has been known for a long time. A new professor at Yale, Professor Rosenthal, and he was in Paris reading medieval manuscripts in Arabic, and he found that the epileptic son of the Chamberlain of the Caliphate Council in Baghdad had epilepsy. He was given cannabis, apparently cannabis with a lot of CBD, and he never had any more attacks, but he had to take the cannabis ever since, and that was 1464, almost 600 years ago. So it's not a new thing, but surprisingly, it was not being used. In collaboration with a group in Sao Paulo in Brazil, we did some preclinical work. There were other collaborators. In the cannabinoid field, collaboration is essential. Nobody can do all the things, chemistry and pharmacology, clinical work by himself. It is collaboration that's needed, and this is what has been going on for a long time. And we tried ultimately, after some preclinical work, and we did a clinical trial. And that was 35 years ago, more than 35 years ago. And we found that administering cannabidiol at relatively high doses to patients with epilepsy is very beneficial. We had controls that didn't get the cannabidiol, and we had patients that got the cannabidiol. And out of the 8 patients that got the cannabidiol, 4 had no more attacks. 3 had very few attacks, and only 1, nothing changed. Now, we published that, and I thought that, well, maybe the people in industry, or maybe groups that have more money than we have and know how to do large-scale clinical trials will do the same thing in a large number of patients. Well, nothing happened, unfortunately, for almost 30 years, until here in this state, it was found that giving cannabis with high cannabidiol lowers or prevents epileptic attack in children. Now, why did we have to wait 35 or 30 years in order to use something that is known, that has been published in a modern journal, that it prevents attacks? Well, I have no answer to that, but it is unfortunate because a huge number of children could have been helped. Well, then we tried to see whether cannabidiol works in diabetes type 1. There are 2 types of diabetes, type 1 and type 2. They're different. Their mechanisms are different. Diabetes type 1 is usually seen in children, originally at least. And we thought that as diabetes type 1 is an autoimmune disease, namely the body attacks itself. We don't always know the reason why it attacks itself, but diabetes type 1 is an attack by the body on the cells that produce the insulin, the material needed. And so we tried that in mice. We had a strain of mice that 100% of them developed diabetes type 1, and we found that yes, while 100% of the mice that had diabetes type 1 and that were not treated, only 30% of the mice that get cannabidiol became sick. So if you look at many numbers, just look at the last one here. You will see that in the controls, only 8% of the cells are intact, but those cells that received cannabidiol, 77% were intact. So there is a physiological reason why we can treat diabetes type 1 with cannabidiol. And we published a few papers on that topic. I know that other groups are interested. And Dr. Makrianis, who is here, is telling me this morning that they've been working on the topic as well. But this is in mice. And we're not mice, and we've been waiting for about 10 years for somebody, whether it's a pharmaceutical company or any other major group with large amounts of money, to do a clinical trial. An academic group has problems doing clinical trials. It costs a lot of money, costs a lot of administration, and normally academic groups, like mine at least, don't have the ability to do that except in special cases. And it's a pity, because in this particular case, diabetes type 1 is not different. Mechanistically, it's not different in mice and in humans. So here we're missing something. I hope that one of these days somebody will do a clinical trial and show, I hope, that one can treat diabetes type 1 with cannabidiol with essentially no side effects. Now there is another disease which has actually been tried in humans. As I said, cannabidiol works on autoimmune diseases, namely diseases in which the body attacks itself. Now, there is a disease called graft versus host disease, which is more or less an autoimmune disease, but caused by us. In some cancer patients, the bone marrow has to be transplanted. And transplantation of the bone marrow causes the body to attack the transplant because it's something new. The body doesn't like to have a transplant from somewhere else. It doesn't know that it's very effective in some cancer diseases. So the body attacks the transplant attacks the body, and the person who has had transplantation of that sort is sick, sometimes very sick. So one of the clinicians, we were involved a little bit with that, one of the clinicians at one of the hospitals in Israel decided to see, as this is an autoimmune disease, maybe cannabidiol will help. And yes, we found that it helps. It helps to an extraordinary degree in a very difficult situation. And if you look at the numbers, those patients, and we had 100 patients as controls and 40 patients as the actual patient that got CBD. In the controls, 46% were sick. Of them, 10% were very sick, and some of them died. While with cannabidiol, only 12% got sick, compared with the 46, and only 5% were very sick. So here we have something which is very practical. It has been shown now in humans to work, and a company is developing cannabidiol against GVHD. A German group has shown that in schizophrenia, high doses of cannabidiol are very effective in schizophrenia. Unfortunately, one has to use nearly 800 milligrams of cannabidiol, but it is at least as effective as the drugs being used today, and it causes no side effect. Most of the drugs being used today do cause side effects. But again, there was a publication, a very good publication, and nothing has happened. Why aren't schizophrenics treated with cannabidiol? Well, no additional work has been done. It should be done because 1% of the population, the world population, has schizophrenia. We can help schizophrenia without side effects with cannabidiol, but unfortunately, nothing is happening at the moment. Now, just as an aside, most of the drugs, or many of the drugs that we get today, are not the natural products, but a derivative. You cannot go and buy penicillin. No such drug exists. You can buy a derivative of penicillin. Corticoids or cortisone. You cannot buy cortisone, a hormone that we have, important one. You can buy a derivative because the companies have usually made derivatives which are better than the natural product. And so we decided to make a derivative of, or derivatives of cannabidiol, putting a fluorine atom on the cannabidiol. And indeed, we found that this new synthetic compound, which is here with a fluorine atom, is much more active than cannabidiol itself. So chances are that within, 10 years, we shall have synthetic compounds, mostly cannabidiol-derived compounds, that will be used in a wide variety of diseases. And I want to mention something that we discovered many years ago, and we called it the entourage effects. Cannabis contains not only cannabinoids, but also quite a lot of other compounds as well. Most of them are not active in any way, but their presence seems to change the activity of the active compounds. Here we have a situation in which 0 activity plus 1, namely activity, gives not 1, but 2 or 3 or 4. So unfortunately, it has not been well investigated, although many users say, yes, cannabis as such is much better than the individual constituents, but this has to be investigated, and I hope that this will be one of the topics that the institute, the new institute here, will be looking at. For nearly 20 years after THC was discovered, we learned a lot about its biochemistry and its degradation and what happens to it in the body and so on and so forth. One thing that was not known was the mechanism. How does it work? And a group in St. Louis and in Howlett discovered that there is a receptor, a specific entity to which THC binds, and this is how it works. And it was found, this particular receptor, in those areas of the brain that one can expect to be areas that have to do with movement, with coordination of movement, of memory, so it is relevant. Now, receptors don't exist in our body because there is a plant out there. Otherwise, we'll have millions of receptors. It's not efficient. Receptors exist because we produce compounds that affect these receptors, stimulate these receptors. So we went ahead looking for the compounds in the brain and in the periphery that are the endogenous compounds that activate these receptors. And we worked rather hard for several years. 2 or 3 colleagues were involved. One came from the US as a postdoc, another came also as a postdoc from the Czech state. And ultimately, we found 2 compounds which are chemically completely different from THC. You can see those, again, you who remember the chemistry. This is the plant material, and these are the compounds found in the brain and the periphery. And it was published 1992, quite a few years ago. Now, these compounds are chemically completely different, but they act exactly like THC, or THC mimics the activity of the endogenous compounds. There is one difference. The plant material stays in the body for a longer period of time. These compounds are formed when and where needed and act when and where needed. And they are of extreme importance. They have been found in mice not to be toxic. They do just about everything that THC does. And these are important compounds. And there we end. These compounds have never been administered to a human. Now that's a strange situation. When insulin was discovered in the 20s, almost 100 years ago, within 6 months or a year, it became a drug, a very efficient drug, a drug that's being used up till today as a major drug in diabetes. Today, it couldn't have happened. As I said, neither anandamide, this compound, neither anandamide, we call the compound that we discovered in the brain, anandamide, nor 2-AG, which was found originally in the periphery, have ever been administered to a human, although they are not toxic and they essentially cause no side effects. Again, I hope that one of these days we shall see that. We know that they're active. We know that they act in animals against many diseases, but nothing has been done in humans. Now, these compounds and the receptors and the enzymes that form them or degrade them form the endocannabinoid system, and this system has turned out to be of extreme importance. Actually, the receptors are found in quantities higher than any other receptor in the brain. They are, as I said at the beginning, involved in a huge number of diseases. So I expect that work will go on with the endocannabinoid system. And originally it was believed that they act, as a close friend of mine wrote, they are involved in relaxation, eating, sleeping, protecting, and forgetting. Well, people will say 4 out of these are positive and forgetting is negative. No, forgetting is not negative. We don't want to remember everything. If we go in a major store and there are 500 people, do we want to remember the faces of 500 people that we don't know? Or, in a more serious thing, in post-trauma. In post-trauma, the endocannabinoid system is not developed in patients that have post-trauma, and they don't forget. And if they don't forget the trauma that they endured, they may become sick, at times very sick with post-trauma, because they don't forget. So actually, over the years, it has been found that the endocannabinoid system is involved in a huge number of situations, and you can see the list. And that list was made a few years ago. If I had to make a modern list, I will see probably twice as many physiological states as I have here. Now, I would not go into biochemistry, of course, and so on, but I want to mention one thing. Most neurotransmitters are formed in the body, and they sit on the synapse of nerves. Now, nerves are not just a string going from here to there. Our body wants to regulate it. So the nerves are broken down at many points. These are synapses. And the signal goes, originally it's an electric signal, it comes to the synapse, and it passes on to the next step chemically. So this is a way for the body to regulate itself. One of the regulators is the endocannabinoid system. Anandamide and 2-AG are formed in the postsynapse, the second part of here, of the synapse. They are formed when needed. They go back here, and they regulate the chemicals that pass on the signal in a nerve. So they are regulators amongst many other things. Now, being a regulator of neurotransmitters means that they were involved in essentially all the effects of these transmitters. So that's one of the reasons they're so important, because they're regulators. But I would not go into details. I'll just go and say a few words about the effects of these endogenous compounds. And for example, we looked at tumor necrosis factor. It's a compound formed in the body that's involved in in quite a few things happening, inflammation, for example. And we saw that these endogenous cannabinoids lower inflammation. This was done first in a test tube and then in vitro, and we saw that most definitely the amount of TNF goes down. We saw that in brain trauma, at least one of the compounds, we didn't test both of them, is very important in brain trauma. And here is some. We saw that a mouse undergoes brain trauma, a mild one. It recovers after 30 days or something like that. And at the same time, after the trauma, the amount of 2-AG, one of the endocannabinoids, goes up nearly 10 times. When we asked ourselves, is that because the brain has been hit and it doesn't know what it's doing, or this is a reaction of the brain to lower the damage being done? So we looked and asked some of our colleagues that know much more about the anatomy of brains, and they indeed found that the amount of damage when the mouse got 2-AG was 50% lower than the amount of those animals that did not get 2-AG. So these endogenous compounds, amongst many other things, these endogenous compounds lower the damage due to brain trauma. So here are just two examples. There are some reactions that go through one of the two receptors. As I said, the first receptor was discovered by Alan Howlett, but there is a second one called CB2, which does not do much in a healthy state. When a person is healthy, it doesn't do much, but it is a very important receptor in many diseases. It acts in parallel, if you wish, to the immune system. Our immune system guards us against many things. Well, the CB2 stimulation of the receptor does the same, but in other fields. And indeed, we found that it's a general protective system in many, many diseases. And we have synthesized compounds that act only on the CB2 receptor. And these compounds seem to be of importance, and quite a few companies are developing their own compounds that act on the CB2. And where does the CB2 work? Well, quite a long list of compounds. In the heart, in the atherosclerosis, in stroke, the liver, etc., etc., etc. So maybe within the next 10 years, we shall see compounds which are cannabinoid derived, but act on only one of the two receptors, not on the CB2, which causes the high, but acts only the CB2 receptor that causes prevention or affects disease states. So this was the second phase, if you wish, of cannabinoid research. The first one was the phytochemicals, namely the compounds that are found in the plant. The second stage is the stage I was describing of the compounds that we form and are of extreme importance in our physiology, and I'm surprised that they were not discovered many, many years ago. And I'm going to speak about the third stage. The third stage, which is going on essentially at the moment, and quite a few groups are working on it. Now, during brain injury, there are two things that are happening in addition to all kinds of damages that bring neuronal cell death, there is also vasoconstriction. The blood vessels constrict. Now that's not very healthy because there is not enough blood going there. And we found that the endogenous compounds, as well as THC, open the system and works against the vasoconstriction, but not strong enough. When we look at what's happening during brain injury, there is something going on which is apparently not by the endogenous cannabinoids. So we said, okay, let's look. Maybe we have compounds that work alongside the endogenous cannabinoids. And so we looked at the regulation of vasodilation, of the constriction and vasodilation of blood vessels. And now, our body, those of you who, again, remember their chemistry, our body is lazy. Once it knows how to do something, it will go on and do it again and again and again, using most of what it knows with slight changes. There is a group of compounds called steroids, and the body has a huge number of steroids. This is a steroid, and the body has learned that by making a change here, one gets hormones. By making here, gets corticosteroids. Making a change here, another compound. Making a change there, still other compounds, which are, all of them are very great importance. So we thought maybe this is happening with the endocannabinoid system itself. Maybe we have compounds that are very much like the endogenous compounds. And indeed, after quite a lot of work, we found that in addition to anandamide and 2-AG, which are the major cannabinoids in our body, contrary to THC in the plant, there are also compounds which are closely related chemically. And again, those of you who remember the chemistry will see that this compound was found, which does not bind to the receptor, is very closely related to the compounds we have in our body, and it works as a vasodilator, much better than the others. So when we have brain trauma, not only do the endogenous cannabinoids help in the brain trauma itself, but there is another compound which acts on vasodilation. So we looked at the compound and we found that it has many of the properties of the cannabinoids, but it does not bind to the receptor. Now, there are a large number of compounds that have been found. For example, the names won't mean to you much, but these compounds, which are closely related chemically to the endogenous cannabinoids, they are derivatives of fatty acid and amino acid. They do a lot of things. For example, one of them, chemical name is arachidonyl glycine, works in pain in pain. The other one, as I mentioned, is a vasodilator. There are compounds that work as neuroprotective agents. And I'll say a few words about compounds that work quite unexpectedly on osteoporosis. And there are related compounds that also are anti-inflammatory, regulate feeding, and so on. So here we have three types of compounds that act in the same, more or less in the same way. The compounds in the plant, the phytochemicals, CBD, THC, the acids, the compounds found in our body, that our body produces anandamide and 2-AG, and then the body makes nearly 120 related compounds, which do not bind to the receptor. They're not cannabinoid in the sense, but they do a lot of other things, and a huge number of people now are working on these compounds. I'll just give one example and end my lecture with that particular one. It was known that women in the Mediterranean, throughout the Mediterranean, Spain, Italy, Israel, Egypt, and so on, have less osteoporosis than women, let's say, in North Europe, in Norway. And it was believed that this happens because they consume olive oil, not any other kind of oil. So we thought, well, let's try that. We tried olive oil, not we, I mean, a colleague, Professor Bob, tried to see whether they affect bones. No, the olive oil did not by itself, but we found that metabolites of the major constituent of olive oil, oleic acid, does that. And the compound we found, again, chemistry is to a certain extent irrelevant. It's very closely related to the endogenous cannabinoids. We didn't know that we're working in the endocannabinoid field. We thought that that's a completely different type of research. We found that the compound closely related to the endocannabinoids blocks the destruction of bone in osteoporosis. Normally, our bones are built and destructed in a way that we keep our bones healthy. But after the age of 50 or 60, in women, in men it's a little bit different, in women, the hormonal things are not the same as previously, and they start losing their bones, and all women should have osteoporosis, which is not true. Only part of them do. And the reason for that is they produce compounds of this sort, the compound that you can see over there, and this compound, again, very closely related to the endogenous compound that we make in the cannabinoid field. And just a few words, there are cells that build the bones and cells that destroy the bones, and this particular compound helps enhance the activity of the cells that build the bones, and that's why it is an anti-osteoporotic agent. And this compound, or derivative of this compound, has now been licensed from the Hebrew University, and they're trying to put it through clinical trials and see whether this can be done. Now, if we look in animals, we see that animals in which the hormonal system has been more or less suppressed, like in women after the age of 55, they start losing their bones, and these are the normal animals. These are the animals that after 35 days of having lost their hormonal basis, the bones go down. But if we give them that new compound, endocannabinoid-like compound, the bones not start growing up again. They're not just, we don't only block the development, we also block the destruction, we also cause the bones to grow. So I hope, again, I hope that within the next few years, maybe a decade, we shall have drugs based on the endocannabinoids that help in osteoporosis. This is just one of the examples, and I want to summarize. The endogenous cannabinoids are involved in a large number of physiological processes. THC mimics their actions. CBD can lead to a wide spectrum of novel drugs. Their fatty acids, these are the derivatives that we find in our body, may lead to better understanding of biological processes as well to novel drugs, and compounds that act specifically on the CB2 receptor, again may lead to a large number of novel drugs, different than the drugs with cannabidiol. So if things work, as I think they will, within 10 years, 15 years, we shall have a lot of new drugs based either on cannabidiol or based on the compounds that act specifically on the CB2 receptor, and maybe millions of us will be using them. I want to thank many of my collaborators, both in my lab over the years. I have a small lab, and these didn't work at the same time, but I have 2-3 people working in the lab at the same time. I collaborate to a large extent with many, many other colleagues, both in Jerusalem and many of the other cities. And even more important, I collaborate with people abroad. Obviously, nobody can do both chemistry and the different types of things that can be done in pharmacology cannot be done in one lab. Nobody has the techniques and the knowledge. So we collaborate, we meet, on and off at meetings, and you can see that from the UK to all kinds of countries, and we discuss, for example, last year we discussed some problems of addiction, and we now have a paper submitted showing how cannabinoids can lower addiction in certain areas. And I have visited most of these places, excellent places to visit, beautiful places. I haven't been in one place, which is Siberia. They had a meeting this year in February, and Dr. Maslow, an excellent scientist, invited me and said, well, the weather this time of the year is okay. It's only minus 25 centigrade. Not usually we have minus 35. Well, I said, thank you, and I thank you. And thanks for attending my lecture.
You should take a seat. Wow, that's, let me share with you that I do know that at 1:45, some of you need to be at presentations or to attend presentations. And so what we'll do is, if you have questions you want to ask Dr. Mechoulam, maybe you can get in line and ask him personally, because I want you to be here for a very special presentation that we have for Dr. Mechoulam. So I'm going to ask President DeMar and Provost Rick Kraminski to come out.
And I had started to accidentally say this when I was introducing Dr. Mechoulam. So while we have 3 plenary speakers at ICR 2017, all eminent researchers, this particular address has special meaning for the Institute of Cannabis Research here at CSU Pueblo. This is our first annual conference. Each year we will have one plenary address of particular significance, which will be known as the Mechoulam Lecture. So in fact, this year we have had Dr. Raphael Mechoulam deliver the first annual Mechoulam Lecture. So in order to mark this auspicious occasion, please allow us, I know we have to go to other sessions, but please allow us to take a moment to convey a sculpture which was created by a local artist, John Wilbar, who was in attendance, to Dr. Mechoulam. For those of you who cannot see the details of it, it may look graphically like a beautiful Colorado mountain. It's an abstraction with perhaps a river coming down. The colors are the university colors of blue and red. But actually, for those of you up close, you may be able to see more particularly what it is. It's actually a triangle or a delta, and the curves are 9. So this is in honor of delta 9 tetrahydrocannabinol.
Thank you. I appreciate that very much.
We'll send it to you.
Yeah. I was just told that it will be sent to me. I don't have to carry it from one place to another.